Have you ever walked into a place of luxury only to feel unwelcome from a single cold glance? Not because you lacked money, not because you lacked status, but because your skin made them believe you didn't belong. My name is Malik Carter, and I remember that day clearly. When the doors of the country club opened, warm golden light poured out. Crystal glasses glittered. Polished white smiles stretched across the room. Yet in that perfect painting of wealth, I, a black man, was the ink stain out of place. Each step I took landed like a drumbeat, a reminder, you're not supposed to be here. The worst part wasn't the looks of disdain. The worst part was how certain they were that I would sit quietly in a dark corner, swallowing the insult in silence. But that was where pain turned into resolve. I hadn't stepped into that room to beg for a seat. I came to prove that real worth can't be erased by prejudice. And then something none of them expected happened. 2 hours later, the room no longer revolved around fake smiles and polite laughter. It revolved around me. Not through shouting, not through force, but through the power of silence. Silence that knows the exact moment to speak. If this story strikes a chord, if you've ever seen or felt that moment of being dismissed, hit the like button, share this video so others can see it, and subscribe with the notification bell on. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to expose what's been hidden. And now, let's go back to the very first moment, where it all began. With one step, right at the door of that country club. I remember that moment vividly. The evening sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the last streaks of sunlight glinting off the country club's tall windows, making the whole building look like a fortress of light. I took a long, steady breath before walking up, not because I was nervous, but because I knew. From the moment I reached the door, every eye would start measuring me. Thomas Briggs, the guard posted at the wrought iron gate, narrowed his eyes as I approached. He wore a dark navy uniform, chest puffed out as though that little badge on his shirt gave him the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. When I pulled the invitation from my jacket, his hand didn't reach for it right away. It stopped halfway, as if even touching it might be some kind of risk. "You sure you were invited?" Thomas asked, voice carrying both suspicion and disdain. That question slammed shut like a door in my face, and it weighed more than the real door standing behind him. I met his eyes, set the invitation down on the wooden podium beside him, letting the warm yellow light hit the bold letters. Malik Carter, guest of honor. I didn't need to say a word. My silence was deliberate, dripping with irony. How many times do I have to prove I belong before you believe it? Thomas scanned the card, muttered something under his breath, then finally gave a stiff nod. The gate swung open slowly, as though letting me in was some kind of favor. I stepped through, surrounded by the sharp bite of expensive cologne, the lingering musk of old leather chairs, and the sweet trace of wine from parties past. Just inside, Clara Dawson, the receptionist with a smile sharpened like a blade, dipped her head politely. But it was the kind of bow that carried no warmth, a formality, nothing more. "Name, please, for confirmation," she said, though the invitation was still in my hand. "Malik Carter," I replied, my voice carrying through the grand lobby. A few heads turned at the sound, eyes flicking my way, pausing on me like I was a stain on the red carpet. Near the bar stood Richard Hale, one of the club's old guard. He looked over, lips curling into a thin, amused smirk, shaking his head like he'd just witnessed a circus act. He didn't bother speaking. His expression did the talking. "You don't belong here." Meanwhile, Clara pretended to scour the guest list, fingers running theatrically down the page until they landed, right where Carter was printed clearly, undeniably. And yet, she hesitated, slowly marking a check before finally muttering, "You may proceed." I smiled faintly, not the smile of a man grateful to be admitted, but of someone watching a clumsy play unfold. I walked on, the click of my shoes on marble sounding louder than it should, each step answering their unspoken question. "I'm here, and you will remember every step I take." For me, this wasn't just about crossing a doorway. It was the first message. Because every time they tried to block me, to doubt me, I didn't shrink. I grew. And within hours, this very room would learn that. The door opened wider, reluctantly, spilling golden light over everything. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above, hundreds of glass drops scattering brightness across the polished floor. Laughter rippled from clusters of men in tailored suits, mingling with the chime of glasses. Every detail here was designed to convince you this was the center of the world. But even under all that shine, I felt it instantly. I was the shadow nobody asked for. Glances darted my way, brows furrowed, smiles faltered. A silent circle of exclusion tightened around me as I moved, always keeping me on the edges. Clara gestured stiffly toward the main hall, her strained grin saying what her voice didn't. "You're allowed in, but don't mistake that for welcome." I kept walking, my footsteps echoing through the music, through the staged laughter. Too loud, they must have thought, too deliberate. Some turned to look, then quickly turned away as though brushing off dust from a spotless sleeve. A cluster of women near the windows, pearls glinting at their throats, fell silent when I passed. One cleared her throat, another sipped her wine too quickly, and then came the brittle laughter, as if covering the awkward gap my presence created. At the bar, Richard Hale lifted his drink, smirk still in place. Not a greeting, more like a warning. A man so certain of his place here and so certain I didn't have one. A man who thought a smirk could shove me back outside without lifting a hand. The contrast was almost theatrical, the room glowing with chandeliers and champagne, people acting like they owned the air itself, and me, the uninvited shadow moving through their perfect stage set. But I knew this much. When they try this hard to make you an outsider, it only makes the cracks in their performance more obvious. I smiled again, this time out of defiance. Not to smooth things over, not to fit in, but to remind myself I didn't need their permission to stand here. Maybe they thought I was enduring it. Maybe they thought my calm was submission. But every cold glance, every stiff smile was another spark falling into place. And when the fire caught, they'd remember who lit it. I slowed my steps, taking in every detail, the music still flowing, the laughter still rehearsed, the lights still glaring. Yet beneath it all, I caught the uneven breaths, the stilled conversations, the tiny slips in their masks. The room itself seemed to admit it. My presence was the one thing they couldn't control. And I knew then, this was only the opening move. I stood beneath the chandelier, light washing over me, eyes tracking every flicker in the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush to explain myself. I let the silence spread, thick and deliberate. Because silence has weight. It unsettles people who expect you to justify your existence. Clara buried herself in paperwork, refusing to look up. Richard hid behind his drink, smile thinning at the edges. Out by the door, Thomas kept glancing in as though waiting for me to make trouble so he could feel right about doubting me. I moved past the tables draped in white cloth, the perfectly centered roses, the symmetry of a room designed to impress. My presence alone threw off their balance, and I realized that was enough. In my mind's eye, the whole place became a symphony, and I was the note out of key. The one they'd remember. The one they couldn't erase no matter how loud they played the rest. Someone started to approach me, stopped midway, torn between curiosity and cowardice. No one wanted to be seen standing too close. I didn't have to do anything. My silence made the choice for them. I stopped beneath the brightest light, letting it crown me whether they liked it or not. If my being here made them uncomfortable, then they could sit with that discomfort. I wasn't leaving. Somebody coughed. A waiter fumbled a spoon onto the floor, the clang slicing through the music. All because I refused to disappear on cue. And that was the moment I knew I had planted the seed. They thought I was outnumbered. They thought silence meant defeat. But in a room full of noise, silence can be the loudest weapon of all. This was only the beginning, and I could already feel the balance starting to shift. I walked slowly toward the main table. On the invitation card, my seat was printed clearly. The front row, right next to those considered the pillars of the club. Guest of honor. I repeated the words in my head, as if to remind myself there was no reason to doubt my place here. But as I approached, the sight before me made me stop for a beat. The chair with my name on its backrest was no longer there. On the seating chart, the line that had read Malik Carter had vanished, replaced by a hastily scribbled name I didn't recognize, as if written in at the last minute. Harold Whitman, the banquet manager, stood nearby, holding the seating chart, his eyes flicking toward me before quickly looking away. I could see the way he pretended to be busy, as though the pen in his hand was more important than the fact that a seat had disappeared right in front of the guest of honor. I stood still for a few seconds, saying nothing. The music still played, laughter still rang across the room, but for me, this moment sucked all the sound out of the air. I looked at the empty chair, then at the blank space on the name board. This erasure was no accident. It was a message delivered loud and clear. You don't belong here. Eddie Lopez, a young waiter, approached, balancing a tray of drinks in his hand. His eyes wavered, carrying both pity and fear. I'm sorry, sir. There must be some mistake, Eddie said softly, just loud enough for me to hear, but his trembling voice betrayed even his own disbelief. I looked at him, then at the chair that had been erased, and smiled faintly. Not a smile of reassurance, but one of bitter irony at this clumsy little performance. A mistake? I repeated in my head. If this was a mistake, it was too precise, too deliberate. Erasing the right person in the right place at the perfect moment. Harold finally turned toward me. He forced a dry smile and said, I'm afraid there was a last-minute change. We'll arrange for you to sit at the back of the room. It's quieter there. I heard every word. The way he emphasized quieter, as though the back of the room was meant for people who didn't count. A place on the margins far enough away that no one could say I'd been excluded, but close enough to render me invisible. I didn't respond right away. I just watched. Watched Harold avoid my eyes. Watched Eddie bow his head in apology without daring to look at me. Watched the other guests smirk as they noticed me standing alone. They weren't hiding it. This wasn't subtle, it was public, and I was the target. In that moment, the whole thing felt like a chess game. They thought they'd made a clever move, erasing my place, pushing me to the edges. But in chess, sometimes the smallest moves spark the biggest reversals. I smiled to myself at the thought. I glanced around the dazzling room. People were busy raising glasses, discussing contracts, convinced that I had been sidelined before the evening even began. What they didn't realize was that this public humiliation had already become evidence. Evidence that the class they flaunted was nothing but a thin coat of paint, ready to crack the moment it was tested. I drew a deep breath and nodded slightly at Harold. No argument, no protest, just a single nod, as though I were accepting the most polite invitation in the world. But inside, I knew this wasn't surrender. It was the first step toward letting them expose themselves even more. I stepped back from the main table, my eyes lingering on the erased chair. In silence, I thought, if one seat can disappear this easily, what else in this room will vanish next? The moment Harold finished his excuse about rearrangements, Eddie Lopez, the young waiter, returned. The awkward smile on his face failed to mask his unease. He bowed slightly, delivering the message with the same borrowed politeness. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the back of the room. Comfortable. The word made me chuckle under my breath. In places like this, comfortable often meant out of sight, away from the tables where handshakes became contracts. Away from the center where whispers over wine glasses turned into influence. I looked Eddie in the eye. His gaze darted nervously, avoiding mine, as though afraid that if he looked too long, he'd reveal that he knew this wasn't an invitation. It was an order, dressed up as courtesy. I didn't answer right away. I let my silence stretch long enough for the air to thicken. Around me, I noticed heads turning. A silver-haired lady clicked her tongue. A heavy-set man fiddled with his tie. The whole room seemed to pause, waiting to see if I would lose my temper or bow my head in defeat. I smiled faintly. A smile no one could quite read, half acceptance, half mockery. Then I nodded slowly, as though I had just been granted some rare privilege. "Fine," I said. My voice was calm, too calm. And that calmness unsettled Eddie more than anger ever could. He led me past the long tables, past the chandeliers pouring light onto the center seats. With each step, I felt myself being escorted off the stage, pushed into the shadows, and I let them see it. I let them enjoy the illusion, believing they had put me in my proper place. At the back of the room, my seat waited against the wall, right beneath a faded oil painting. No flowers on the table. No crisp white tablecloth. Just a lonely chair, perfectly suited for the role they wanted me to play. The outsider. I sat down. The chair creaked, as though it too disapproved of being part of this little farce. Folding my arms, I let my eyes sweep across the room. From here, I could see everything. The fake smiles, the loud toast, the hands clasped too tightly in pursuit of profit. The irony wasn't lost on me. From this corner seat, I had the best view in the house. I took a sip of the water waiting on the table. It was tasteless, flat, utterly forgettable. The perfect drink, I thought, for the role they'd assigned me. Presence without flavor, existence without acknowledgement. Harold glanced in my direction, convinced he'd won. But I knew better. This move was only the beginning. When someone is pushed to the edges, they start to notice things the people at the center never see. And sometimes the end game begins on the margins. I sat silently, letting this comfort they'd granted me turn into its own satire. Because the harder they tried to hide me, the less they realized they'd given me the perfect vantage point. I raised an eyebrow and took another sip of water. If my seat could disappear, if my place could be erased so easily, I wanted to see what else in this room would reveal itself next. The chair creaked again as I leaned back. People glanced over, seeing me sitting still, not reacting, assuming that meant defeat. But they had no idea that every second of my silence was a blade tucked up my sleeve. From this corner, I became the invisible witness, the uninvited guest in the backstage of their grand performance. And this play was worth watching. At the main table, Richard Hale laughed louder than usual, swirling his wine like a man desperate to prove his importance. Every nod came with a booming chuckle, but I saw it, the flicker of anxiety in his eyes. He scanned the room constantly, checking who was watching, who was listening. The man who thought he owned the room was terrified of being ignored. Harold Whitman kept stealing glances toward me, pretending to inspect the waitstaff. His eyes would land on me for a second before darting away, the way guilty men avoid mirrors. I smirked faintly. This act wouldn't last long. Eddie Lopez passed by with another tray of drinks. He deliberately avoided my table, but I caught the quick glance he threw my way. It was the look of someone who knew injustice when he saw it, but was too afraid to intervene. I didn't blame him. In this room, silence was survival, but I wasn't here to survive. I was here to remember. I remembered the bursts of laughter whenever someone looked toward me. I remembered the silver-haired women whispering as though I were the evening's scandalous entertainment. I remembered Clara Dawson's eyes always avoiding mine, as though my existence smudged the pristine page she was trying so hard to keep clean. I took another sip of water. Its dullness made me smile. How ironic, I thought. They believed pushing me to the margins erased me. But from here, I had the clearest view of all. From here, I saw the alliances forming in hushed tones, the subtle rivalries hidden behind fake toast, the nervous glances of men who thought they ran the room. I let them believe they'd won. I let them think I'd been removed from the game. But in my mind, every detail clicked into place like chess pieces. A missed handshake, a vanished chair, a glass of flavorless water. all part of a bigger picture they didn't even know they were painting. I leaned back, shoulders relaxed. To anyone watching, I looked like I'd surrendered, like I'd accepted my role on the sidelines, but the truth was the opposite. I had never been in a stronger position, because from the edges, you can see the whole board. I smirked faintly, eyes locked on the glowing main table. If they believed a missing chair could erase my worth, then let them wait, because from this corner seat, I was about to make the whole room turn and face me. The sound of red wine pouring into crystal glasses played like a soft melody. Each ripple of crimson shimmered beneath the chandeliers, flowing like liquid velvet. From my corner seat, I watched the glasses along the long table slowly fill. An unspoken ritual, yet one that carried a clear message. This was the sign of welcome, the silent declaration, "You belong here." The glass in front of me stayed empty. The waiter passed by, tilting the bottle toward the next table, then skipping mine with practiced ease, as if my seat didn't exist at all. I said nothing, made no gesture to call him back, because sometimes deliberate omission speaks louder than any gesture of inclusion. I waited, and then, a few minutes later, a hand finally set something in front of me. Not a crystal wine glass glinting in the light, but a thick, heavy tumbler of plain water. Cold, no ice, no lemon slice, just a dull, flat transparency. Eddie Lopez was the one who brought it. He didn't meet my eyes, only bowed slightly. "For you, sir," he murmured, voice small, stripped of all enthusiasm. I knew Eddie was just following orders, a pawn carrying out someone else's decision, but that didn't make it sting any less. While the entire room raised glasses of wine, I was given a lukewarm afterthought. I tilted my head slightly, looking at the glass. In its surface, I caught my own reflection, a still, silent face blurred by water. A perfect metaphor, really. They wanted me colorless, flavorless, leaving no trace. Margaret Pierce, a society matron seated a few chairs down, accepted her glass of wine, then glanced my way. Her lips curled faintly, a look caught somewhere between amusement and disdain. She didn't need to speak. The glance said everything. "Exactly where you belong. Water suits you." At the main table, Richard Hale raised his wine high, voice booming as though he wanted the whole hall to hear. "To a prosperous new year, a year of opportunity and success." Cheers erupted, glasses clinked, laughter spilled over in waves. And I, with my glass of water, sat apart from the symphony like a wrong note no one wanted, but everyone heard. But I didn't feel humiliated. I felt intrigued. Because in that moment, they revealed what they tried so hard to conceal. Those glasses of red wine weren't just drinks. They were symbols of belonging. And being denied one had just become the clearest proof of the dividing line drawn here tonight. I set my hand on the water glass, not drinking yet. I let it sit there, a silent exhibit in this case they were building against themselves. I heard the wine kiss their lips, the soft hiss of pleasure as they savored it. And I smiled faintly because I knew sometimes a single glass of water carries more weight than a century-old bottle of wine. I tapped the rim lightly, letting it stand out among the rows of glittering crystal. In my head, I thought, if they believe a glass of water can diminish me, they'll soon learn it may be the very thing that turns this entire room on its head. I hadn't even lifted the glass yet when a burst of laughter rang out from the next table. Too loud, too long. Laughter designed to be overheard. A silver-haired man in a slate-gray suit leaned toward me, grinning lazily. Charles Denton. A longtime member, famous for speaking at the perfect moment. The kind of man who turned cruelty into performance. He narrowed his eyes, lips curling into a half-smile. Water suits you better, doesn't it? The words floated out lightly, but they landed with the weight of a slap. A few others nearby laughed along, those brittle, empty laughs of people who weren't sure it was funny but wanted to be on the right side of the room. And just like that, I understood. This wasn't banter. This was a blade wrapped in silk. I turned toward Charles, met his eyes. He didn't look away. He even raised his glass of red wine toward me in mock salute, as though I were the guest of honor at my own humiliation. The gold rings on his fingers glittered in the light, reflecting vanity more than elegance. The laughter swelled. People tried to hide it by turning aside, but the smirks lingered. It was a familiar kind of laughter, the kind that came from people certain the whole room was with them, certain I would stay small while they stayed comfortable. I didn't respond. I let the words hang in the air, unanswered. The silence stretched, long enough for Charles's grin to falter slightly, though he tried to hold it. He'd expected me to flare up, to take the bait, to give the room the spectacle it wanted. Instead, I sat there calmly, turning the glass slowly between my fingers, gaze steady, unbothered. Inside, I almost laughed. The irony was sharp enough to taste. They thought wine meant power while water meant nothing. But they forgot. Wine is luxury. Water is survival. Remove wine, people live. Remove water, everything dies. I almost wanted to thank him. You're right, Charles, I thought. Water does suit me. Because from the place you think is beneath you, I'll make this glass echo louder than your entire toast. Margaret Pierce coughed softly. She didn't laugh. She didn't join in. Her eyes flickered once, then turned away. That single gesture told me enough. Not everyone in the room thought this was harmless fun. I lifted the glass, tilting it so the surface rippled, catching the light. I didn't drink yet. I just held it there, letting the laughter around me shrivel in its own echo. Sometimes you don't need to fight back. You just wait. The silence does the work for you. Charles finally looked away, his smirk dimming. He took another swallow of wine, as though trying to wash the awkwardness from his throat. I set the glass back down, smiling faintly. If one joke could make the whole room laugh, then one small act could make the whole room fall silent. I sat there, the water still cold against my palm. Around me, the noise went on. The clinking, the scripted laughter, the champagne toast that had been rehearsed for years. I looked at my glass, clear, scentless, tasteless. Yet because of that, it made me smile. Wine can dull the senses. Water keeps you sharp. And tonight, sharpness was what I needed most. I turned the glass slowly, letting the light scatter off it. Then, deliberately, I raised it to eye level. Calm, unhurried, as though I were toasting with the finest champagne in the room. The laughter stumbled. I saw Charles Denton blink. He had just mocked the water, yet here I was, lifting it with the solemnity of a king. His grin slipped, caught off guard by the reversal. Margaret Pierce lowered her own glass, tilting her head slightly, watching me. There was something like curiosity in her eyes now. Amusement, even. Not because my act was grand, but because it was so simple. A simplicity sharp enough to slice through the room's polished hypocrisy. Eddie Lopez passed by, tray in hand, the rim of the glasses trembling faintly. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch, fighting a smile. He understood. He knew I'd just flipped the script without saying a single word. I touched the water to my lips, took a small sip. Flavorless, but I drank it as though it were vintage champagne. Then I set the glass down again, composed, silent. The quiet stretched wider than the joke ever had. A few guests shifted in their seats. Some glanced at each other, puzzled. Others looked down, fidgeting with napkins as if unsure whether to speak. No one laughed. I smiled faintly. Because the sharpest answer isn't anger or noise. It's turning what they used to diminish you into the very thing that unsettles them. That glass of water, once meant as mockery, had become my statement. I don't need your wine to have a voice. I'll make even this water speak for me. In a room where symbols ruled everything, that single act rattled them. Because it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was precise. I tapped the rim softly, letting the note ring out, clear and small. If one glass of water could shake them this much, I wondered how the room would hold up when the real game began. The room's chatter began to shift. Handshakes snapped like familiar background music, the slap of palms meeting, the crisp laughs that followed, the steady rhythm of such a pleasure and great to see you again. I sat in my chair against the wall, water still rippling in my glass, watching it all like a reluctant audience member. Then I saw him. Gerald Whitmore, a longtime member of the executive board. The kind of figure everyone knows. A suit tailored to perfection, silver hair combed just so, a smile rehearsed 1,000 times in the mirror to look natural. Gerald moved through the room like a king dispensing favors. He extended his hand, each shake delivered, each laugh appended, as if every person he touched had just been certified as someone who belonged here. I watched without overthinking. I knew that moment would come. It came sooner than I expected. Gerald made his way to the cluster near me. He shook Richard Hale's hand. Richard immediately bobbed his head a little lower to show respect. He shook Margaret Pierce's hand, dipping his chin as though greeting royalty. Then he clasped the hand of the gray-haired businessman beside me, giving him a friendly pat on the shoulder. I held out my hand, not fast, not slow, an easy, polite, steady motion. I kept my eyes on his, confident the inevitable would happen. But Gerald's hand stalled in midair. For a split second, I saw confusion flash in his eyes before he quickly turned his head, pretending to strike up a conversation with someone across the way. His hand withdrew, neatly, efficiently, as if a handshake with me had never been part of the script. I stayed where I was, my hand hovering for a second longer, then I drew it back, unhurried. A brief pocket of silence formed, long enough for a few looks to land on me, long enough for a smirk to tug at the corner of Richard Hale's mouth. Gerald moved on without a word, without a corrective gesture, leaving me there with a hand that had just been refused. I didn't feel anger. I felt intrigued. The game was getting blunt. If erasing my seat could be excused as a mix-up, a withdrawn handshake was evidence no one could deny. The pretense had dropped its mask. I set my hand in my lap, sat up, and let a thin smile spread across my lips. Not to hide a bruise, to mock the incident itself. Gerald thought he'd erased me, but that move made me the center of the room for a few seconds. Not because I was welcomed, because I was excluded, and everyone saw it. A server passed with a trembling tray of glasses, casting me a glance tinged with pity. I didn't need pity. I needed the silence that had just settled over the room. A silence born from a small act that revealed more than any speech. I took another sip of water, let the chill run down my throat, and thought, a refused handshake can weigh more than 100 insults, and from that very spot, I'll turn it into a counterstrike. I leaned back slightly, eyes tracking Gerald as he went on bestowing favors. If one handshake could strip the room bare, I wondered, what would the next slip reveal? My hand hung there in the air, a glare of an image impossible to ignore. I left it there for a beat or two, long enough for Gerald Whitmore to realize he'd created an awkward void. Long enough for curious eyes around me to register the moment. Then I drew my hand back. Not abrupt, not bitter. I reclaimed it with measured calm, as if I were the one choosing to end the handshake that never happened. The smile stayed, thin and unreadable, but in my eyes the forbearance was gone. I looked straight at Gerald. Without a word, the look was enough to unsettle him. Just a heartbeat, but I saw his certainty wobble. A man used to granting legitimacy by touch now tripped over the absence of it. Richard Hale noticed. He took another drink to hide the smirk, but I caught the flicker of delight in his eyes. For Richard, anyone could be entertainment, as long as it wasn't him. I let him enjoy it. Because the truth was, Gerald had handed me a gift, a public proof that I was being cut out. And I didn't need to tell the story. Everyone had witnessed it. I rolled my water glass a fraction, light breaking into fine slivers on the table. I said nothing, letting the silence tighten. It spread to others. The ones who'd laughed along with Charles Denton earlier were quiet now. Maybe they were realizing how these small details, stacked together, were forming a picture that wouldn't be easy to erase. Gerald kept circling, pretending nothing had happened. But his gait stiffened, his smile lost its gloss. He could feel my eyes on his back, and others' eyes too. The more he tried to hide it, the more the farce showed. I smiled for myself alone, a sardonic smile at the victory they thought they'd won. I didn't need noise to answer. A look, a smile, and silence were enough to flip his snub into a reverse performance. Someone whispered behind me, "He hasn't said a word." I heard it. I wanted them to. My silence wasn't submission. It was a statement. I see. I know I will remember. Right then I felt the difference between them and me. They survive on the crowd's approval, on handshakes, laughter, light. I don't need it. I can turn even a snub into leverage. The very lack of acknowledgement made my presence heavier. I took a sip of water. Cold, flat, clarifying. Gerald thought he'd cut me out of the evening's flow. In truth, he'd just written my name across the room, etched by an omission that no one could deny. I set the glass down, eyes still on Gerald's receding figure. If a single missed handshake could rattle him, I wondered what would happen when I chose the moment to offer my hand again. No one spoke for a breath or two, but the silence carried farther than any accusation. It rippled outward, touching every glass, every half-finished smile. No one had to say a thing, yet everyone understood. A line had just been drawn through the room. Gerald moved on, bending to shake more hands, but his back was stiff, like a statue trying to act alive. His deliberate snub, so small he thought, left a larger aftershock than he imagined. Because it wasn't just my story anymore, it became a mirror, reflecting the truth of this place. Polished on the surface, cracked underneath. I sat still, hands on the table, that faint smile lingering. I heard the light scrape of silver on china, a clumsy cough from somewhere in the corner, like someone trying to plaster over the awkwardness leaking into the air. Each tiny sound made the silence louder. Richard Hale drank, saying nothing. He savored it, but even he avoided my eyes. Margaret Pierce set her hand fan down and tilted her head, as if to resettle herself, but I saw her grip tighten on the handle. Others, so used to the choreography of shaking hands and chatting, no longer knew whether to carry on as if nothing happened, or admit they'd just seen something undeniable. I let the silence stretch. That was deliberate. I knew silence can be louder than a charge. It forces people inward, makes them face their own guilt or their complicity. I rotated the water glass again, shards of light skittering across the table. A simple gesture, but it drew a few more glances. They wanted me to speak, to crack the tension with a joke or a gracious "forget it." I didn't. I let the silence live. I made it my weapon. For Gerald, a missed handshake might have felt trivial. For the witnesses, it turned into evidence. Proof that the discrimination here no longer hid behind polite varnish, and once a truth stands in the open, no one can stuff it back in the box. I felt no anger, only clarity. I didn't need to shout to prove I'd been wronged. I just had to sit there, look straight ahead, and let everyone hear the echo of the space Gerald left behind. I caught the furtive glances passing between guests. Unease flickered in their eyes. They understood that this silence had cracked the evening's carefully staged perfection. All that borrowed glamour relied on what no one mentioned. Tonight, a single retracted hand had split the wall. I leaned back, breathed evenly, and let the quiet speak for me. In that moment, I knew. They'd accidentally given me a gift. One that needed no words, yet could unsettle the entire room. I lifted one corner of my mouth, eyes sweeping the floodlit tables. If silence alone could tilt the room, I wondered what would happen when I finally chose to speak. When everyone had settled, the spotlight hit the polished wooden podium at the center of the room. Jonathan Reed, the longtime host, stepped up. He was the kind of man who knew how to steer a crowd with a confident smile, and a voice trained to sound warm but carry its own brand of self-made authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone gliding like he was opening a grand ceremony. "It's truly an honor to welcome so many familiar faces from our community." He read out a few names, each one followed by polite applause and satisfied smiles. Then Jonathan paused. His gaze drifted across the front row, landing on the one empty chair, the chair that should have carried my name. The whole room followed that look, and in that short, heavy silence, I knew exactly what was coming. Jonathan tilted his head, his smile curling into something faintly secretive. He raised the microphone, dropped his voice half a step lower. Perhaps not everyone belongs here. The laughter came sharp and quick, spreading like a knife sliding into soft wood. It wasn't friendly laughter, it was thin, cold, a sound with edges. A few people laughed outright, others wore stiff, knowing smiles, eager to prove they got the joke. Only a handful stayed quiet, looking away, unwilling to join in but too timid to object. I sat at the back of the room, beneath a faded oil painting, letting every ripple of laughter reach me. It bounced off the walls, hit me, then broke apart. No one pointed a finger, but no one had to. The whole room knew the empty chair bore my name. The whole room knew exactly who that joke was for. I set my hand on the water glass in front of me. Clear, still. Like the silence I had carried with me all evening. I didn't raise it. I didn't tap it against the table. I just left my hand there. I wanted them to see I'd heard every word, understood every word, and chose to answer in my own way. And in that moment, I realized something. People don't always shove you out the door. They can shove you right there, in plain view, in front of everyone, with a single joke wrapped in polite language. And they believe you won't dare to answer because any reaction will be labeled too sensitive. I smiled faintly, a small, unreadable smile. Because what they didn't understand was this. That joke didn't just diminish me. It exposed them. It cracked the polished surface of their laughter, their crystal glasses, their perfect lighting, revealing the prejudice sitting right beneath it. I looked at the front row, at the lights washing over them, and thought, go ahead, laugh. But remember, laughter is like wine. It can make you feel giddy for a moment, but when it fades, it always leaves the bitterness behind. I didn't need to accuse Jonathan Reed. He'd done that himself the moment he spoke. All I had to do was sit there, let my silence and my thin smile rise up as the only response necessary. And I knew from the corner of my eye a few faces in the crowd were already beginning to shift. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on that empty seat at the front. If one joke could make the whole room erupt in laughter, I wondered, what would happen when I chose the moment to make the whole room fall silent? I sat there, the glass of cold water before me, while laughter erupted around the main table. In that moment, I felt as if I'd been torn from the room. My body was still here, beneath the glittering chandelier, but my presence had been stripped away. I had become the shadow against the wall, the shadow they felt free to use as a punchline, as the backdrop for their laughter to echo louder. The humiliation wasn't confined to me alone. It spread outward like an unspoken declaration to everyone watching. This is the boundary. This is his place. Jonathan Reed's joke wasn't aimed at me alone. It was a message to anyone like me, a reminder that the seat of honor in this room was never meant for people like us. I looked around. A few eyes met mine, then quickly darted away. They wanted no part of this moment. Some lowered their heads, offering awkward smiles, pretending to fix their napkins. They didn't want to face the truth that they had just laughed along with a public exclusion. Margaret Pierce sat at a nearby table. She didn't laugh, but she didn't protest either. Her lips were pressed tight, her hand clutched the handle of her fan. In her eyes, I read something different. Not sympathy, but unease. The unease of someone who knew this was wrong, but also knew that speaking up would mean standing apart from the crowd. Richard Hale was different. He lifted his glass, laughing heartily, his shoulders shaking with every chuckle. For Richard, this was perfect entertainment. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of pitying amusement, because his fleeting joy revealed a deeper truth. His sense of power was so fragile, he needed to diminish others to reinforce it. I drew in a slow breath. In my head, the irony rang clear, sitting in the very room, yet erased from it. A kind of expulsion with no door, no guards, Just a single joke. I set my hand on the glass of water. For a moment, I thought of everyone who had felt this before, erased from the picture, not by loud violence, but by refined mockery. And I understood. What was happening to me tonight wasn't personal. It was just another chapter in a script performed everywhere, from boardrooms to classrooms, from dinner parties to cafes. I didn't rise to respond. I didn't walk out. I sat there, smiling faintly. Because I knew this much. If they thought that joke could erase me from the room, they were wrong. In fact, it did the opposite. That joke wrote me into the center of it. No one would remember the rest of Jonathan Reed's speech, but everyone would remember the moment he threw that barb. And in that memory, I was no longer the shadow on the wall. I was the point of reference for the entire room. I took a sip of water. The bland taste sharpened my thoughts. A single truth echoed through my mind. Laughter can cut like a blade. But blades can slip and cut the very hand that wields them. I set the glass down, letting the soft chime of crystal against wood carry through the air. If one joke was enough to make me the center of every gaze, I wondered, what would happen when I chose the moment to return that laughter to the entire room? I slowly turned the glass of water in my hand, listening to the laughter still drifting around the room. It no longer rang out with the force it had before. It had thinned, stretched on, like a piece of music stumbling off tempo, with people forcing out a few more notes just to keep the air from collapsing. I took a deep breath, then set the glass down on the table. Clack! The sound was small, almost delicate. But in that room, it struck like the gavel of some invisible judge. The entire hall froze. Heads tilted toward each other lifted at once. Smiles that had been halfway formed shut tight. No one expected that such a simple sound could cut through the noise and pull every eye toward it. I said nothing. I just sat there, my hand resting on the rim of the glass, my gaze sweeping the room with calm detachment. Yet somehow that silence, woven together with that single clack, had become a statement that needed no words at all. Up on the stage, Jonathan Reed stood motionless, the microphone still in his hand. He faltered, just slightly, the rhythm of his practiced poise breaking for the first time. A tiny crack? Yes, but in a night so carefully choreographed, even a crack this small looked like a fissure. Some people stared at me. Curious, uneasy, calculating. Richard Hale blinked too quickly, then pretended to turn to the person beside him, his hand trembling faintly around the stem of his wineglass. Margaret Pierce leaned forward, her eyes locked on me as if waiting to see what I would do next. I let them wait. I didn't speak, didn't signal, didn't move beyond that faint smile on my lips. But already the balance in the room had shifted. From being the subject of their laughter, I had become the person the entire room now waited on. And inside I was amused. People can mock you with 100 jokes, but sometimes one sound at the right moment is enough to make them hear themselves. Tonight, I didn't need speeches. I didn't need to argue. That single clack had done the work for me. I looked toward the main table, at the empty seat still sitting under the spotlight, the seat that once bore my name. It sat there like a silent witness, and in my mind, a thought sharpened. They could erase my name from the chart, push me to the edge of the room, turn me into the center of a public joke, but they couldn't control what I did with it. From across the hall, I saw Gerald Whitmore, the man who had bypassed my handshake earlier, frowning down toward me. Perhaps he too realized that his slight no longer lived in isolation. It had become part of a bigger picture, a picture the clack had just traced into focus. I leaned back slowly, deliberately letting the pause in the room stretch tighter. They all wanted me to speak now, but I didn't. I let the waiting itself become a blade, so each person could hear the echo in their own minds. A slight lift of my eyebrow, a thin smile crossing my face. Because if one sound alone had been enough to still the entire room, I wondered, what would happen when I finally chose to speak? The heaviness left behind by my single clack still lingered in the room. But then the lights overhead shifted again, gathering into a single beam on the polished wooden stage at the center, Arthur Langston, the evening's keynote speaker, stepped forward with the practiced posture of a man accustomed to being watched. His suit was perfectly pressed, his navy tie knotted just so, his eyes radiating the kind of confidence people rehearse in mirrors. He began with the usual smooth phrases, talking about the spirit of community, about our shared legacy, words that could have been lifted straight from any other banquet script, but the audience still applauded on cue. Because what they sought wasn't meaning, it was the familiar rhythm of a ritual that assured them they belonged. I sat silently at the back, my hand resting on the glass of water, watching Arthur. He spoke fluently until the small crack appeared. His voice slipped. The last note of a sentence broke, harsh and off-key, drawing a few subtle frowns. He paused, cleared his throat, tried to smile it off. But then he fumbled the pages in his hands, turning to the wrong one, then flipping back again. A low ripple moved through the room. Soft coughs, the shifting of chairs, the clearing of throats. The gap opened. Not the dignified hush of respect, but the awkward emptiness of people unsure whether to look up or down. Arthur tried to recover his pace, but his voice wavered now, his words snagged. The more he pushed forward, the faster that polished confidence eroded. I saw the beads of sweat form under the golden lights. A few guests traded glances. Faint smiles flickered, not polite ones, but the involuntary kind that slip out when someone else's composure cracks. And in that moment, the irony hit me. They had pushed me out to the edge of the room, tried to erase me from the center of this space. Yet it was the center itself, the man they had chosen to command the night, that was unraveling under the same spotlight meant to keep me invisible. The air grew tight like a rope stretched thin, waiting for anyone to snap it. Jonathan Reed, the master of ceremonies, sat frozen in the front row. He couldn't rush the stage to rescue Arthur, not without confirming for the whole room that there was, in fact, a disaster unfolding. The other guests, sensing the same tension, stayed still, a silent audience inside a cooling room. I lifted the glass of water, let the tastelessness slide down my throat. From my corner seat, I saw everything more clearly than anyone in the center. The trembling speaker, the uneasy crowd, the widening gap on the stage like a door left half open. And I laughed inside. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to move. The play was collapsing on its own. The men who had styled themselves as the pillars of this evening were shaking now, right there under the lights. And the best part? A gap like this never stays open long. Someone, sooner or later, will have to step into it. I set my glass down, eyes on the bright stage. If one cracked note was enough to rattle the center, I wondered, who would be the first to walk through that open door? The air inside the hall was strung tight like a violin string. On stage, Arthur Langston fumbled through his pages, his lips moving but no longer forming full sentences. Murmurs began to rise like waves, carrying snippets of laughter from table to table. The chandeliers blazed overhead, but the center of the room was drowning in awkward shadows. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out, not loud but sharp enough for the entire room to hear. Why not? Let him try. The words cut through the air like a stone dropped into a tense, still lake. Every head turned toward me at once. That voice carried the tone of a dare. It wasn't a polite invitation. It was someone tossing me a noose, pretending to be friendly while waiting to see if I'd tighten it around my own neck. I stayed seated. For a moment, I felt my heart beat in my chest. Not from fear, but from the awareness that this was the moment they'd been waiting for. The man pushed to the margins would now stumble, refuse, or turn himself into the evening's punchline. A few people chuckled. Short, sharp laughs laced with provocation. Richard Hale tapped the table with his fingers, nodding as though he endorsed the spectacle about to unfold. Margaret Pierce didn't laugh. She lifted her fan, shielding half her face, but her eyes stayed fixed on me. Worried, curious, or simply waiting. Arthur Langston looked down from the stage, relief flickering across his face. Clearly, he saw this as his lifeline. If I stepped up, he'd escape humiliation. If I declined, the room's discomfort would be dumped back into my lap. Either way, Arthur was no longer alone at the center of the storm. I smiled, just slightly. In the dim light pooling in the corner, that smile made a few people freeze. They had been expecting hesitation. Instead, I gave them calm. I swirled the glass of water in my hand, letting the clear surface ripple. A small gesture, but in my mind it carried the weight of a reply. If you want me to perform, then wait and see how different my performance will be. No one in the room realized it yet, but that dare had handed me a gift. A chance to turn the margins into the center. A chance to make their mockery the invitation itself. And I had no intention of refusing. I set the glass down. Clack! The sound rang out again, quiet but sharp enough to cut the air. Several heads turned. Then I rose. Slowly. Not rushing, not flaunting. Just a simple, steady movement. But inside the room's strained silence, it carried the weight of an opening act. I let my eyes sweep the room, the faint smile never leaving my face. If they thought they'd tossed me a noose, I wondered, what would they do when I turned that rope into a bridge and walked straight across it? I rose. No microphone. No papers. No introduction. Just me, stepping out from that chair against the wall, silent, deliberate. All eyes followed. Some were curious, some carried open disdain, others flickered with hesitation, as if unsure whether they were about to witness a fool's misstep or a turning of the tide. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch. A deliberate silence, not the silence of someone being muzzled, but the silence of someone in control. Second by second, it swelled, pressing down on the coughs, cutting off the whispers, forcing heads to lift. For a few long moments, I, without a microphone, was the loudest thing in the room. I scanned the hall slowly. The chandelier light slid over faces taut with anticipation. I saw Jonathan Reed, lips tight. Arthur Langston, relieved like a man who thought he'd escaped one disaster but didn't realize he'd walked into another. And Richard Hale, leaning back with his arms folded, that smug half-smile on his lips, convinced I was about to fall on my own sword. I smiled. Not warmly, not for charm, but the smile of someone who knows exactly what game is being played. And then I began. Not with a speech. Not with numbers or slogans. I began with my story. I remember the first time I was invited to a place like this. My voice carried evenly, not raised, not rushed, just steady enough to slip through the stillness now draped across the room. I spoke of the guard's suspicious look when I walked through the door, of the seat with my name on it, erased, of the glass of water placed before me like leftovers from someone else's table. Every detail I mentioned landed heavy. People shifted in their chairs because they had seen these things tonight. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I just told the truth, and the truth was enough to crack a few polite smiles on the edges of certain faces. I let a note of irony sharpen my words. They say water's good for your health. Maybe they thought I needed it more than the rest of them. A few short laughs slipped out. Not mocking laughs this time, but startled ones. The kind people make when the absurdity hits too close and they don't know how else to react. I paused, letting the room breathe, my eyes locking briefly with Margaret Pierce. She tilted her head, her eyes clearer now. She understood. I wasn't speaking to myself. I was speaking to the room. I went on. The funny thing about being pushed to the margins is, sometimes from there, you see the whole picture better than anyone sitting at the center. I spoke slowly, letting the words fall heavy, one by one, until the silence felt carved out, deliberate, waiting. I didn't need a microphone. The room was quiet enough that my voice traveled clean, unamplified, but sharp as glass. They heard every word because the silence itself made them listen. And in that moment, I knew the game had flipped. They thought they'd thrown me into a trap. But the trap was already closing around them. The trap of truth, spoken plainly with no apology, no disguise. I drew a slow breath, my eyes sweeping the entire hall. And I thought, if this little piece of the story can already strip the smiles from a few faces, what will happen when they hear all of it? I let my eyes sweep slowly across the room, and then stop. My voice dropped lower, not to persuade them, but to invite them into an old memory. I remember when I was a kid, lining up to join the school basketball team. The coach looked me up and down and said, "We're full." But right after, I watched a white kid stroll in late and get sent straight onto the court. That day, I sat on the sidelines, ball in my lap, the bench burning hot under the afternoon sun. That was the first time I realized some doors don't stay shut because you knocked wrong. They stay shut because the one holding the keys never wanted you inside. The room fell still. I caught a few eyes blinking quickly like they'd been yanked back into their own memories. I remember applying for an internship at a local bank. I wore my best shirt, old but neatly pressed, walking in with my paperwork in hand. The receptionist didn't even glance at the forms. She looked me over once and said, "We're not taking any more applicants." A week later, I heard a classmate brag about landing that same spot. His grades were worse than mine. And that's when I learned, sometimes they're not rejecting your resume. They're rejecting the image you carry with you. I paused, letting the silence carve those words deeper into the room. Then I smiled, not to soften it, but to twist the irony tighter. But here's the thing. Every rejection, I didn't just remember it, I used it. Every ounce of scorn they handed me, I laid it down like a brick. Every suspicious glance, I stacked it higher. Until, without realizing it, they built me a staircase with their own disdain. A short laugh escaped from the back of the room. Not mockery, but surprise. I glanced that way and gave the slightest nod, like a handshake in silence. I remember every word, every look. They taught me to stand straighter. They thought their contempt would drag me down. They never realized I was learning to turn it into a launching pad. My eyes locked on the empty chair at the main table, the one that once bore my name before it disappeared. "Like tonight," I said, my voice even but sharp enough to cut. They thought erasing one chair would make me smaller. What they didn't see is that they handed me the story I'm telling all of you right now. I heard someone exhale sharply. A chair shifted faintly against the floor. The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It had turned into something else. A focused, waiting stillness. I didn't need a microphone. My words drilled through the air slowly, steadily, cutting through the thick quiet like steel on stone. And I knew, once a room like this starts to really listen, the game has already changed hands. I drew a breath, scanning the faces that no longer wore smirks. And I thought, if just a handful of memories can shift the air in here, what will happen when I take them deeper into the rest of my story? At first, when I started speaking, a few stray laughs still broke out. Short, sharp, like needles pricking the air. But the longer I spoke, digging into the rejections, the quiet humiliations, the blatant hypocrisies they themselves had witnessed tonight, those laughs began to fade. I heard the exact moment the room shifted. No more chairs creaking as people leaned toward each other to whisper. No more snickering from the far corners. What replaced it was a thicker silence, heavy, dense. Not the silence of people waiting for me to trip. The silence of people who had just been exposed. I scanned the room. The once confident faces now sat rigid. A few pressed their lips together. A few eyes darted away. Richard Hale stayed still, his glass frozen midair. There was a flicker of irritation in his eyes, like he knew this time. The laughter was no longer on his side. Margaret Pierce slowly set her fan down on the table. She wasn't smiling anymore, but she wasn't looking away either. Her gaze locked on me now, as if admitting the truth I spoke had finally filled the space she and so many others had tried to avoid. Jonathan Reed sat in the front, lips tight. He was used to controlling the room with words, with jokes, with rhythm. But the rhythm wasn't his anymore. I had taken it by staying silent long enough, then breaking it exactly when I chose. I didn't raise my voice. I wasn't giving a speech. I was just telling a story. But it was the telling, the plain, unpolished telling that turned into a mirror. And what they saw in that mirror wasn't flattering. I took another sip of water, letting the silence spread thick as fog rolling across the floor. I knew what they were replaying in their heads. Thomas Briggs at the door. The empty chair at the main table. The water glass dropped carelessly in front of me. I didn't need more evidence. The room itself had supplied it all. A thin smile tugged at my mouth. Not the kind meant to comfort. The kind that says, you wrote this script yourselves, I'm only reading it aloud. Somebody coughed, the sound sharp in the stillness. Another shifted in their seat, then froze, afraid to draw attention. These small reactions made the silence ring even louder. I didn't rush to finish. I let the room sit in it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing isn't shouting. It's letting people hear the echo inside themselves. I looked at the empty chair at the main table. It sat there still, a piece of evidence needing no defense. Then I turned back to the room, my voice even. Sometimes the thing erased is the thing people remember most. My words weren't loud, but they landed like a stone tossed into a glassy lake. I set the glass down, waited, and I thought, if a few memories in one sentence can turn mockery into this kind of silence, what will happen when they're forced to hear the whole story they never wanted to face? I looked around the room. The silence had changed now. It was no longer the silence of contempt, but the silence of waiting. And I decided to break it. Not with an accusation, but with a small story, a single detail sharp enough to catch them off guard. I remember once, I began, my voice lighter. I walked into an upscale boutique. The saleswoman looked me up and down, then said, "Sorry, sir, this store might not be the right fit for you." I asked, "Not the right fit? How?" She replied, "Because we only sell high-quality items here." A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. I caught the glances darting across the tables, as if they were asking each other, "Did I hear that right?" I continued, a faint smile tugging at my lips. I didn't argue. I just pointed at my polished shoes and said, "Good thing. I only buy high-quality items. So maybe we fit better than you think." This time the laughter broke out clearly. But it wasn't mockery. It wasn't derision. It was release, the laughter of surprise, the laughter of people forced to admit the absurdity hiding inside a polished prejudice. Richard Hale, who had worn that smirk all evening, let out a reluctant chuckle. Margaret Pierce raised her fan to cover her mouth, but her shoulders shook with amusement. Even Jonathan Reed, the host himself, took a sip of wine to disguise the hint of a smile. I smiled too. I knew this moment mattered. Because just like that, I had pulled them from the tightness of silence into a kind of uneasy empathy. This laughter wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a bridge. The story had turned into a mirror, and in it, everyone could see the ridiculousness of a bias dressed up in sophistication. I kept my voice even, my tone light. The funny thing is, every time I was dismissed like that, I never had to shout. I never had to fight. All I had to do was use their own words and flip them over. Just like tonight, I don't need a microphone. I don't need the seat of honor. All I need is a glass of water. A new wave of laughter rolled through the room. Not loud, not cruel, but even warm like the room itself was finally exhaling. Inside, I knew this was the turning point. The silence had exposed them, but the laughter was pulling them toward me. I wasn't the shadow by the wall anymore. I was the storyteller, the one who now held the rhythm of the room with nothing but a voice and a touch of irony. I let the laughter fade, then lowered my voice. "And you see," I said slowly, "even when they gave me a glass of water instead of champagne, I could still raise it as if it were crystal and gold. Because value has never been in the glass. It's in how you choose to lift it." The laughter softened, leaving behind a warmer quiet, a quieter closeness. The room had changed color. I placed my hand lightly on the glass of water, tilted my head toward the room and thought, if one ironic story could bring their laughter back to me, what will happen when I give them the real ending to this night? Time passed. I wasn't counting the minutes, but I could feel the slow shift in the room. The loud laughter from earlier had thinned out. The whispers behind raised wine glasses had turned into hesitant glances. 2 hours later, the air no longer felt like the same room I had first walked into. Gerald Whitmore, the man who had once pulled his hand back from mine, now walked toward me. Not quickly, but each step carried a trace of reluctance. I saw his hand hover by his side, as if rehearsing the gesture he had once denied me. When he reached me, Gerald forced a smile, his voice lower than usual. "Mr. Carter, your talk tonight was truly impressive." I tilted my head slightly, a thin smile curling on my lips. I didn't extend my hand right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel the weight of a gesture he had thought was meaningless 2 hours ago. Only then did I offer my hand, a light handshake, no pressure, as if to remind him this moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or at least the discomfort of a man who knew he no longer held the power to dismiss. Richard Hale, the one who had raised his glass earlier, laughing at every slight thrown my way, he didn't approach at all. But I caught his eyes meeting mine, just for a second, before he quickly looked away. And instead of that mocking grin, he left only a small nod, unrequested, unnecessary, yet enough to admit the shift in the room. At the far table, Charles Denton, the man who had once smirked, "Water suits you better," lifted his glass. This time, his gaze met mine not with mockery, but with a clumsy, silent toast from afar. I didn't lift my glass back. I only smiled. Because sometimes, not responding is the sharpest response of all. One by one, others began adjusting their posture, their tone, their entire demeanor. The same women, who had whispered behind their fans earlier, now offered small nods as they passed. Some men, who had leaned back in their chairs at first, like spectators enjoying a show, now sat straighter, their eyes following me, without the earlier contempt, but with something closer to caution. I stayed seated, letting the shift unfold on its own. I didn't speak. I didn't summon. They were the ones rewriting the order of the room, with their own hesitant gestures, their own uneasy silences. The irony was almost too perfect. They had built a wall to shut me out. But in just 2 hours, the bricks had started to crumble. And now, they were the ones stepping over the ruins, to come find me. I thought back to when I first walked in. Thomas Briggs's suspicious eyes at the door, the vanished chair, the glass of cold water placed before me. Each moment had been a blade. Now, each blade had turned itself around, not because I fought back with fury, but because the truth itself had been enough to flip the entire table. I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly. I knew this wasn't the final victory. Not yet. This was just the moment. The room finally admitted one thing. They had been wrong about me. And that unspoken admission was louder than every fake applause from earlier in the night. I drew in a slow breath, my eyes sliding over Gerald's unease, Richard's bowed head, Charles' awkward toast. And I thought, if 2 hours was all it took to turn the entire room, what will happen when I finally stand up and tell them this room belongs to me? I didn't step onto the stage. I didn't grab the microphone, didn't try to force myself into the center. I simply stayed where I was, at the table by the wall, with the half-finished glass of water before me. And yet I could feel it. The entire room had begun to turn toward me. Not with applause, not with praise, but through the shift in their eyes. When I first arrived, their glances were like blades, sharp, slicing me out of the collective picture. Now those same eyes returned, hesitant, measuring, then lingering longer than before. I saw the ones who had once leaned back, smirking, now sitting straighter, as though waiting for my next move, to tell them how to react. I didn't do much. I only placed my hand on the glass, turned it slightly as though indifferent to their attention. But the more effortless I became, the more they were drawn in. Because people fear a silence that carries confidence, far more than they fear an angry shout. Jonathan Reed, the MC, tried at first to reel the room back in. He tossed out a few jokes, but the laughter came thin, hollow, fading too quickly. Once he glanced at me, then looked away, like a man used to holding the reins, who suddenly realized the reins were no longer in his hands. Arthur Langston, the keynote speaker, sat frozen, the papers on the table before him trembling slightly. He knew now that his speech was just a shadow. The room wasn't listening to him anymore. The room was listening to me, even though I hadn't said another word. Richard Hale, the man who had laughed the loudest earlier, now quietly spun his wine glass in slow circles. Each turn of the glass looked like a way to avoid looking up. I caught the discomfort in his jaw, the discomfort of a man who had believed he controlled the story, but was now forced to watch it slip away. I didn't smile in triumph. I only kept the same thin, unreadable smile, the kind that reminds people, you don't need to shout, don't need to fight for space. You just have to stand there, and the truth will do the rest. The great irony was this: they had pushed me to the margins. But from the margins, I could see the entire board. And when I finally stood, when I told my story, I didn't need to claim the center. The center had already come to me. I could feel the air change. At first, it had been thick with contempt. Now it glimmered with something else: expectation. Every glance, every small movement, leaned toward me, as though the room itself had accepted a new center of gravity. I drew in a slow breath, letting silence blanket the room again. I wanted them to understand. This wasn't a performance. This was presence. And that presence alone was enough to turn the entire night upside down. I set the glass back down on the table. The soft clink rang out. And I thought, if I can stand here silently, and the entire room already turns toward me, what will happen when I finally choose to take it in my own hands? I looked around. The room glowed beneath the chandelier's light, and the faces, the same faces that once smirked, once turned away, were now all turned toward me. And I realized this moment was no longer about a missing chair, a refused handshake, or a glass of cold water. It had become something larger. I stood tall, my hand resting lightly on the back of the nearest chair, my voice low but clear. How many times have we been pushed to the margins? No one answered. But I saw it ripple through them, the bowed heads, the furrowed brows, the subtle nods, as if for the first time tonight, they were willing to admit something to themselves. I let the pause stretch, so the question could carve itself deeper. Then I spoke again. And how many times have we come back, not just to walk in, but to own the entire room? Silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't tense. It wasn't awkward. It was the silence of absolute attention, as though each person heard the question, landing directly at their own feet. I reached for the glass of water. The same clear glass, the one handed to me as if it were an insult. I lifted it slowly, letting the light catch the water, casting a sharp reflection into a few watching eyes. Then I smiled. I don't need champagne, I said softly. Because sometimes the thing they value the least is exactly what they'll remember the most. A small wave moved through the room. No one laughed out loud, but the nods grew clearer, firmer. Even Gerald Whitmore, the man who once refused my handshake, kept his eyes fixed on the table, his hand clenched tight, as if wrestling with himself. I turned, walked slowly toward the head table. No invitation. No nameplate. I didn't need either. The room had already fallen silent, already made space for my presence, without a single word of permission. I stopped before the empty chair. The same chair that had been erased from the seating chart hours ago. Now it stood here, a monument to their earlier rejection. I set the glass of water on the table, a soft clink echoing through the air, like a period at the end of their performance. I didn't sit. I didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. From the edge of the room, I had walked to the center, and no one stopped me. I looked around once more, then repeated, this time my voice lower, but carrying. How many times have we been pushed to the margins? And how many times have we come back? Not just to walk in, but to own the entire room? In that moment, I knew I had done it. Not through force. Not through shouting. But through presence, through story, through turning their contempt into the very weapon that undid them. I drew in a long breath, my gaze moving slowly, from Gerald to Richard to Jonathan. And I thought, if tonight, A black man like me can turn a glass of water into a symbol that shifts an entire room. How many other rooms, how many other worlds are waiting for the same thing to be turned upside down? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired,